On the Nature of the Gods, by Marcus Tullius Cicero. Chapter 21. Cotta, with his usual courtesy, then began. Velleius, says he, were it not for something which you've advanced, I should have remained silent. For I've often observed, as I did just now upon hearing you, that I cannot so easily conceive why a proposition is true as why it's false. Should you ask me what I take the nature of the gods to be, I should perhaps make no answer. But if you should ask whether I think it to be of that nature which you've described, I should answer that I was as far as possible from agreeing with you. However, before I enter on the subject of your discourse and what you've advanced upon it, I'll give you my opinion of yourself. Your intimate friend, L. Crassus, has been often heard by me to say that you were beyond all question superior to all our learned Romans, and that few Epicureans in Greece were to be compared to you. But as I knew what a wonderful esteem he had for you, I imagined that might make him the more lavish in commendation of you. Now, however, though I do not choose to praise anyone when present, yet I must confess that I think you've delivered your thoughts clearly on an obscure and very intricate subject, that you're not only copious in your sentiments, but more elegant in your language than your sect generally are. When I was at Athens, I went often to hear Zeno, by the advice of Philo, who used to call him the chief of the Epicureans, partly probably in order to judge more easily how completely those principles could be refuted after I had heard them stated by the most learned of the Epicureans. And indeed, he did not speak in any ordinary manner, but, like you, with clearness, gravity, and elegance. Yet what frequently gave me great uneasiness when I heard him, as it did while I attended to you, was to see so excellent a genius falling into such frivolous, excuse my freedom, not to say foolish doctrines. However, I shall not at present offer anything better. For as I said before, we can in most subjects, especially in physics, sooner discover what is not true than what is. Chapter 22. If you should ask me what God is, or what his character and nature are, I should follow the example of Simonides, who, when Hiero the tyrant proposed the same question to him, desired a day to consider of it. When he required his answer the next day, Simonides begged 2 days more, and as he kept constantly desiring double the number which he had required before, instead of giving his answer, Hiero, with surprise, asked him his meaning in doing so. Because, says he, the longer I meditate on it, the more obscure it appears to me. Simonides, who was not only a delightful poet, but reputed a wise and learned man in other branches of knowledge, found, I suppose, so many acute and refined arguments occurring to him, that he was doubtful which was the truest, and therefore despaired of discovering any truth. But does your Epicurus, for I had rather contend with him than with you, say anything that's worthy of the name of philosophy, or even of common sense? In the question concerning the nature of the gods, his first inquiry is whether there are gods or not. It would be dangerous, I believe, to take the negative side before a public auditory, but it is very safe in a discourse of this kind and in this company. I, who am a priest, and who think that religions and ceremonies ought sacredly to be maintained, am certainly desirous to have the existence of the gods, which is the principal point in debate, not only fixed in opinion, but proved to a demonstration. For many notions flow into and disturb the mind, which sometimes seem to convince us that there are none. But see how candidly I will behave to you. As I shall not touch upon these tenets you hold in common with other philosophers, consequently I shall not dispute the existence of the gods, for that doctrine is agreeable to almost all men, and to myself in particular. But I am still at liberty to find fault with the reasons you give for it, which I think are very insufficient. Chapter 23. You have said that the general assent of men of all nations and all degrees is an argument strong enough to induce us to acknowledge the being of the gods. This is not only a weak, but a false argument, for first of all, how do you know the opinions of all nations? I really believe there are many people so savage that they have no thoughts of a deity. What think you of Diagoras, who is called the atheist, and of Theodorus after him? Did not they plainly deny the very essence of a deity? Protagoras of Abdera, whom you just now mentioned, the greatest sophist of his age, was banished by the order of the Athenians from their city and territories, and his books were publicly burned, because these words were in the beginning of his treatise concerning the gods. I am unable to arrive at any knowledge whether there are or are not any gods. This treatment of him, I imagine, restrained many from professing their disbelief of a deity, since the doubt of it only could not escape punishment. What shall we say of the sacrilegious, the impious, and the perjured? If Tubulus Lucius, Lupus, or Carbo, the son of Neptune, as Lucilius says, had believed that there were gods, Would either of them have carried his perjuries and impieties to such excess? Your reasoning, therefore, to confirm your assertion, is not so conclusive as you think it is. But as this is the manner in which other philosophers have argued on the same subject, I will take no further notice of it at present. I rather choose to proceed on what is properly your own. I allow that there are gods. Instruct me then concerning their origin, inform me where they are, what sort of body, what mind they have, and what's their course of life. For these I am desirous of knowing. You attribute the most absolute power and efficacy to atoms. Out of them you pretend that everything's made. But there are no atoms, for there's nothing without a body. Every place is occupied by a body. Therefore there can be no such thing as a vacuum or an atom. Chapter 24. I advance these principles of the naturalists without knowing whether they are true or false, yet they are more like truth than those statements of yours, for they are the absurdities in which Democritus, or before him Leucippus, used to indulge, saying that there are certain light corpuscles, some smooth, some rough, some round, some square, some crooked, and bent as bows, which by a fortuitous concourse made heaven and earth, without the influence of any natural power. This opinion, Sivelaeus, you have brought down to these our times, and you would sooner be deprived of the greatest advantages of life than of that authority. For before you were acquainted with those tenets, you thought that you ought to profess yourself an Epicurean, so that it was necessary that you should either embrace these absurdities or lose the philosophical character which you had taken upon you. And what could bribe you to renounce the Epicurean opinion? Nothing, you say, can prevail upon you to forsake the truth and the sure means of a happy life. But is that the truth? For I shall not contest your happy life, which you think the deity himself does not enjoy unless he languishes in idleness. But where is truth? Is it in your innumerable worlds, some of which are rising, some falling at every moment in time? Or is it in your atomical corpuscles, which form such excellent works, without the direction of any natural power or reason? But I was forgetting my liberality, which I had promised to exert in your case, and exceeding the bounds which I at first proposed to myself. Granting, then, everything to be made of atoms, what advantage is that to your argument? For we are searching after the nature of the gods, and allowing them to be made of atoms, they cannot be eternal, because whatever is made of atoms must have had a beginning. If so, there were no gods till there was this beginning. And if the gods have had a beginning, they must necessarily have an end, as you have before contended when you were discussing Plato's world. Where then is your beatitude and immortality? In which two words you say that God is expressed, the endeavor to prove which reduces you to the greatest perplexities. For you said that God had no body, but something like body, and no blood, but something like blood. Chapter 25. It is a frequent practice among you, when you assert anything that has no resemblance to truth and wish to avoid reprehension, to advance something else which is absolutely and utterly impossible, in order that it may seem to your adversaries better to grant that point which has been a matter of doubt than to keep on pertinaciously contradicting you on every point, like Epicurus, who, when he found that if his atoms were allowed to descend by their own weight, our actions could not be in our own power, because their motions would be certain and necessary, invented and expedient, which escaped Democritus, to avoid necessity. He says that when the atoms descend by their own weight and gravity, they move a little, obliquely. Surely to make such an assertion as this is what one ought more to be ashamed of than the acknowledging ourselves unable to defend the proposition. His practice is the same against the logicians, who say that in all propositions in which yes or no is required, one of them must be true. He was afraid that if this were granted, then in such a proposition as Epicurus will be alive or dead tomorrow, either one or the other must necessarily be admitted. Therefore he absolutely denied the necessity of yes or no. Can anything show stupidity in a greater degree? Zeno, being pressed by Arcesilaus, who pronounced all things to be false which are perceived by the senses, said that some things were false, but not all. Epicurus was afraid that if any one thing seen should be false, nothing could be true, and therefore he asserted all the senses to be infallible directors of truth. Nothing can be more rash than this, for by endeavoring to repel a light stroke, he receives a heavy blow. On the subject of the nature of the gods, he falls into the same errors. While he would avoid the concretion of individual bodies lest death and dissolution should be the consequence, he denies that the gods have body, but says that they have something like body, and says that they have no blood, but something like blood. Chapter 26. It seems an uncomfortable thing. How one soothsayer can refrain from laughing when he sees another. It is yet a greater wonder that you can refrain from laughing among yourselves. It is no body, but something like body. I could understand this if it were applied to statues made of wax or clay, but in regard to the deity, I'm not able to discover what's meant by a quasi-body or a quasi-blood. Nor indeed are you, Velleius, though you won't confess so much. For those precepts are delivered to you as dictates, which Epicurus carelessly blundered out. For he boasted, as we see in his writings, that he had no instructor, which I could easily believe, without his public declaration of it, for the same reason that I could believe the master of a very bad edifice if he were to boast that he had no architect but himself. There is nothing of the Academy, nothing of the Lyceum, in his doctrine. Nothing but puerilities. He might have been a pupil of Xenocrates. O ye immortal gods, what a teacher was he! And there are those who believe that he actually was his pupil, but he says otherwise, and I shall give more credit to his word than to another's. He confesses that he was a pupil of a certain disciple of Plato, one Pamphilus at Samos, for he lived there when he was young, with his father and his brothers. His father, Neocles, was a farmer in those parts, but as the farm, I suppose, was not sufficient to maintain him, he turned schoolmaster. Yet Epicurus treats this Platonic philosopher with wonderful contempt. So fearful was he that it should be thought that he had ever had any instruction. But it is well known he had been a pupil of Nausiphanes, the follower of Democritus, and since he could not deny it, he loaded him with insults in abundance. If he never heard a lecture on these Democritean principles, what lectures did he ever hear? What is there in Epicurus's physics that is not taken from Democritus? For though he altered some things, as what I mentioned before of the oblique motions of the atoms, yet most of his doctrines are the same. His atoms, his vacuum, his images, the infinity of space, innumerable worlds, their rise and decay, and almost every part of natural learning that he treats of. Now, do you understand what's meant by quasi-body and quasi-blood? For I not only acknowledge that you're a better judge of it than I am, but I can bear it without envy. If any sentiments indeed are communicated without obscurity, what is there that Velleius can understand and Cotta not? I know what body is, and what blood is, but I cannot possibly find out the meaning of quasi-body and quasi-blood. Not that you intentionally conceal your principles from me, as Pythagoras did his from those who weren't his disciples, or that you're intentionally obscure like Heraclitus, but the truth is, which I may venture to say in this company, you don't understand them yourself. Chapter 27. This, I perceive, is what you contend for, that the gods have a certain figure that has nothing concrete, nothing solid, nothing of express substance, nothing prominent in it, but that it's pure, smooth, and transparent. Let us suppose the same with the Venus of Cos, which is not a body, but the representation of a body. Nor is the red, which is drawn there and mixed with the white, real blood, but a certain resemblance of blood. So in Epicurus's deity there's no real substance, but the resemblance of substance. Let me take for granted that which is perfectly unintelligible. Then tell me what are the lineaments and figures of these sketched-out deities. Here you have plenty of arguments by which you would show the gods to be in human form. The first is that our minds are so anticipated and prepossessed that whenever we think of a deity, the human shape occurs to us. The next is that as the divine nature excels all things, so it ought to be of the most beautiful form, and there is no form more beautiful than the human. And the third is that reason cannot reside in any other shape. First, let us consider each argument separately. You seem to me to assume a principle, despotically I may say, that has no manner of probability in it. Who was ever so blind in contemplating these subjects as not to see that the gods were represented in human form, either by the particular advice of wise men who thought by those means the more easily to turn the minds of the ignorant from a depravity of manners to the worship of the gods, or through superstition, which was the case of their believing that, when they were paying adoration to these images, they were approaching the gods themselves. These conceits were not a little improved by the poets, painters, and artificers. For it would not have been very easy to represent the gods planning and executing any work in another form, and perhaps this opinion arose from the idea which mankind have of their own beauty. But do not you, who are so great an adept in physics, see what a soothing flatterer, what a sort of procuress nature is to herself? Do you think there's any creature on the land or in the sea that is not highly delighted with its own form? If it were not so, why would not a bull become enamored of a mare, or a horse of a cow? Do you believe an eagle, a lion, or a dolphin prefers any shape to its own? If nature therefore has instructed us in the same manner that nothing is more beautiful than man, what wonder is it that we, for that reason, should imagine the gods are of the human form? Do you suppose if beasts were endowed with reason that every one would not give the prize of beauty to its own species? Chapter 28. Yet by Hercules, I speak as I think. Though I am fond enough of myself, I dare not say that I excel in beauty that bull which carried Europa. For the question here is not concerning our genius and elocution, but our species and figure. If we could make and assume to ourselves any form, would you be unwilling to resemble the sea Triton as he is painted, supported, swimming on sea monsters whose bodies are partly human? Here I touch on a difficult point, for so great is the force of nature that there is no man who would not choose to be like a man, nor indeed any ant that would not like to be an ant. But like what man? For how few can pretend to beauty? When I was at Athens, the whole flock of youths afforded scarcely one. You laugh, I see, but what I tell you is the truth. Nay, to us who, after the examples of ancient philosophers, delight in boys, defects are often pleasing. Alcaeus was charmed with a wart on a boy's knuckle, but a wart is a blemish on the body, yet it seemed a beauty to him. Cucutellus, my friend and colleague's father, was enamored with your fellow citizen Roscius, on whom he wrote these verses. As once I stood to hail the rising day, Roscius appeared on the left I spied. Forgive me, gods, if I presume to say, the mortal's beauty with the immortal vied. Roscius, more beautiful than a god? Yet he was then, as he now is, squint-eyed. But what signifies that, if his defects were beauties to Catullus? Chapter 29. I return to the gods. Can we suppose any of them to be squint-eyed, or even have a cast in the eye? Have they any warts? Are any of them hook-nosed, flap-eared, beetle-browed, or jolt-headed, as some of us are? Or are they free from imperfections? Let us grant you that. Are they all alike in the face? For if there are many, then one must necessarily be more beautiful than another. And then there must be some deity not absolutely most beautiful. Or if their faces are all alike, there would be an academy in heaven, for if one god does not differ from another, there is no possibility of knowing or distinguishing them. What if your assertion, Velleius, proves absolutely false, that no form occurs to us in our contemplations on the deity but the human? Will you, notwithstanding that, persist in the defense of such an absurdity? Supposing that form occurs to us, as you say it does, and we know Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Neptune, Vulcan, Apollo, and the other deities by the countenance which painters and statuaries have given them, and not only by their countenances, but by their decorations, their age and attire. Yet the Egyptians, the Syrians, and almost all barbarous nations are without such distinctions. You may see a greater regard paid by them to certain beasts than by us to the most sacred temples and images of the gods. For many shrines have been rifled, and images of the deities have been carried from their most sacred places by us. But we never heard that an Egyptian offered any violence to a crocodile, an ibis, or a cat. What do you think, then? Do not the Egyptians esteem their sacred bull, their apis, as a deity? Yes, by Hercules, as certainly as you do our protectress Juno, whom you never behold, even in your dreams, without a goat skin, a spear, a shield, and broad sandals. But the Grecian Juno of Argos and the Roman Juno are not represented in this manner, so that the Grecians, the Lenivinians, and we ascribe different forms to Juno, and our Capitoline Jupiter is not the same with the Jupiter Ammon of the Africans. Chapter 30. Therefore, ought not a natural philosopher, that is, an inquirer into the secrets of nature, be ashamed of seeking a testimony to truth from minds presupposed by custom? According to the rule you've laid down, it may be said that Jupiter is always bearded, Apollo always beardless, that Minerva has gray, and Neptune azure eyes. And indeed we must then honor that Vulcan at Athens, made by Alcamenes, whose lameness through his thin robes appears to be no deformity. Shall we therefore receive a lame deity because we have such an account of him? Consider likewise that the gods go by what names we give them. Now in the first place, they have as many names as men have languages, for Vulcan is not called Vulcan in Italy, Africa, or Spain, as you are called Velleius in all countries. Besides, the gods are innumerable, though the list of their names is of no great length even in the records of our priests. Have they no names? You must necessarily confess, indeed, they have none. For what occasion is there for different names, if their persons are alike? How much more laudable would it be, Velleius, to acknowledge that you do not know what you do not know, than to follow a man whom you must despise? Do you think the deity is like either me or you? You do not really think he's like either of us. What is to be done, then? Shall I call the sun, the moon, or the sky a deity? If so, they're consequently happy, but what pleasures can they enjoy? And they're wise too, but how can wisdom reside in such shapes? These are your own principles. Therefore, if they're not of human form, as I proved, and if you cannot persuade yourself that they are any other, why are you cautious of denying absolutely the being of any gods? You dare not deny it, which is very prudent of you, though here you are not afraid of the people, but of the gods themselves. I have known Epicureans who reverence even the least images of the gods, though I perceive it to be the opinion of some that Epicurus, through fear of offending against the Athenian laws, has allowed a deity in words and destroyed him in fact. So in those his select and short sentences is recalled by you, Kuriai Doxai. This, I think, is the first. That being which is happy and immortal is not burdened with any labor, and does not impose any on anyone else. Chapter 31. In his statement of this sentence, some think that he avoided speaking clearly on purpose, though it was manifestly without design, but they judge ill of a man who had not the least art. It is doubtful whether he means that there is any being happy and immortal, or that if there is any being happy, he must likewise be immortal. They do not consider that he speaks here, indeed, ambiguously, but in many other places both he and Metrodorus explain themselves as clearly as you have done. But he believed there are gods, nor have I ever seen anyone who was more exceedingly afraid of what he declared ought to be no objects of fear, namely death and the gods, with the apprehensions of which the common rank of people are very little affected. But he says that the minds of all mortals are terrified by them. Many thousands of men commit robberies in the face of death. Others rifle all the temples they can get into. Such as these, no doubt, must be greatly terrified, the one by the fears of death, the others by the fear of the gods. But since you dare not, for I am now addressing my discourse to Epicurus himself, absolutely deny the existence of the gods, what hinders you from ascribing a divine nature to the sun, the world, or some eternal mind? I never, says he, saw wisdom in an irrational soul in any but a human form. What? Did you ever observe anything like the sun, the moon, or the 5 moving planets? The sun, terminating his course in 2 extreme parts of one circle, finishes his annual revolutions. The moon, receiving her light from the sun, completes the same course in the space of a month. The 5 planets in the same circle, some nearer, others more remote from the earth, begin the same courses together, and finish them in different spaces of time. Did you ever observe anything like this, Epicurus? So that according to you, there can be neither sun, moon, nor stars, because nothing can exist but what we have touched or seen. What? Have you ever seen the deity himself? Why else do you believe there is any? If this doctrine prevails, we must reject all that history relates or reason discovers, and the people who inhabit inland countries must not believe that there is such a thing as a sea. This is so narrow a way of thinking that if you had been born in Seriphus and never had been from out of that island, where you had frequently been in the habit of seeing little hares and foxes, you would not therefore believe that there are such beasts as lions and panthers, and if anyone should describe an elephant to you, you would think that he designed to laugh at you. Chapter 32. You indeed, Velleius, have concluded your argument not after the manner of your own sect, but of the logicians, to which your people are strangers. You have taken it for granted that the gods are happy. I allow it. You say that without virtue no one can be happy. I willingly concur with you in this also. You likewise say that virtue cannot reside where reason is not. That I must necessarily allow. You add, moreover, that reason cannot exist but in a human form. Who do you think will admit that? If it were true, what occasion was there to come so gradually to it, and to what purpose? You might have answered it on your own authority. I perceive your gradations from happiness to virtue, and from virtue to reason, but how do you come from reason to human form? There, indeed, you do not descend by degrees, but precipitately. Nor can I conceive why Epicurus should rather say the gods are like men than that the men are like the gods. You ask, what is the difference? For say you, if this is like that, that is like this. I grant it. But this I assert, that the gods could not take their form from men, for the gods always existed and never had a beginning, if they are to exist eternally. But men had a beginning. Therefore that form of which the immortal gods are must have had existence before mankind. Consequently the gods should not be said to be of human form, but our form should be called divine. However, let this be as you will. I now inquire how this extraordinary good fortune came about, for you deny that reason had any share in the formation of things. But still, what was this extraordinary fortune? Whence proceeded that happy concourse of atoms, which gave so sudden a rise to men in the form of gods? Are we to suppose the divine seed fell from heaven upon earth, and that men sprung up in the likeness of their celestial sires? I wish you would assert it, for I should not be unwilling to acknowledge my relation to the gods. But you say nothing like it. No, our resemblance to the gods, it seems, was by chance. Must I now seek for arguments to refute this doctrine seriously? I wish I could as easily discover what is true as I can overthrow what is false.